Do you know anybody who is in your family or a friend of yours who you would describe as an abundant giver? I don't just mean money, I just mean life in general. They're just an abundantly generous person. When I think of that, I think of my mom. My mom is an abundant giver. She loves to give to others, and not just give, she is not ever content just to give to others. She always loves to add something extra when she gives. It's not enough that maybe she stayed up hours into the night making a homemade chocolate pie or German chocolate cake for you, but when she gives it to you, she always says, "Oh, and here's a little something else I thought you might like." It's just a sweet, beautiful picture of someone who has a heart for really going the extra mile, giving the extra portion in order to bless someone else. Today, we're going to see how God does that same thing for us. We're going to see how lavish His grace is. And we're going to see this from a very unexpected chapter in the Bible. 2 Kings chapter 3 is not what you would call a well-known passage of Scripture. In fact, my guess is you've never heard a sermon from 2 Kings chapter 3, unless you've been in a church where the pastor teaches all the way through the Bible. And even then, there's a good chance that he skipped that one. Today, we're not going to skip it, even though it's a chapter that might easily be overlooked. It seems like nothing more than some historical data about a few kings going to war, and then some weird instructions about them having to dig a bunch of ditches in a valley. And so it could easily be sort of set aside as something that's not quite as important as the big, exciting chapters, but I have been really filled with anticipation for today to dig beneath the surface here and see some really beautiful and helpful truths that God has for us in this passage. So in our study through the Bible, we saw 2 weeks ago that wicked King Ahab died under the direct word and providence of the Lord. We saw last week how Elijah was taken up into heaven and how Elisha now is the prophet in Israel. And so I want to read the first, I think it's maybe 7 verses of 2 Kings chapter 3, just to help set the scene for us here. So we begin with verse 1. It says, "Now Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel at Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 12 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord." How's that for an epitaph? He did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not like his father and mother, Ahab and Jezebel. For he put away the sacred pillar of Baal that his father had made. And then we get to that painful word, nevertheless. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. He did not depart from them. Verse 4. "Now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder, and he regularly paid the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So King Jehoram went out of Samaria at that time and assembled all Israel." In other words, he brought the troops together. Verse 7, "Then Jehoram went and sent word to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, saying, 'The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab?' And he said, 'I will go up. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses.'" And we read that and think, I am already completely confused with who these people are. So let's take a quick second. We have 3 main characters in these opening verses. First, we have Jehoram, who is the king of Israel. Then we have Jehoshaphat, who is the king of Judah. And then we have Mesha, who is the king of Moab. And we can learn an awful lot from these 3 men. We could take a week easily, I think, on each of them. But just briefly, so we saw here Jehoram, the son of Ahab, is at least credited for not being quite as evil as his father and mother had been. It says that he did at least take down the pillar of Baal that his father had set up. And we go, okay, that's good, sort of. But then there's verse 3 that starts with the word nevertheless. Take a look at that again on the screen. Nevertheless, he did what? He clung to the sins of Jeroboam. Jeroboam, we go way back to, I think it's 1 Kings 12, where we were introduced to Jeroboam, who ruled after Solomon, and he introduced worship of golden calves there. And that sin that Jeroboam brought has been like a slow infection that's been creeping through the people of God for years and years and years. And now here we get way down the line, and we see that Jehoram is still holding on to those sins that Jeroboam introduced a long time ago. You can almost feel the frustration and the disappointment of the Bible here when it says he got rid of one evil thing. Nevertheless, he held on to other sins. He's one of those half-measure people. He's one of those half-hearted commitment kind of people, never fully committing himself to doing what was right. Now, Jehoram wasn't a follower of God, but you and I are. And as his followers, we do not have the option of being half-hearted, half-measure followers of his. Let me remind you of the words that Moses charged God's people with back in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. He said this, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God by walking in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord that I am giving you this day." Why? Because God wants to weigh you down? No, for your own good. So what does God want from you? Oh, only everything. Only everything that you are, everything that you have, completely, unreservedly, forever. And you might think, if you haven't spent time in church, you might think, well, who does God think he is to demand something like that of me? Well, let's look at the next verse. Verses 14 to 21 summarize this. "Behold, to the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, and the earth and everything in it. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God. He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome wonders that your eyes have seen." Oh, that's right, that God, the one who is the creator and sustainer and ruler over everything. Listen, he will not accept half-hearted devotion, no more than you would accept that from your spouse. Imagine your spouse saying, "I love you, but nevertheless, there's someone else across town I love as well." Who would want to live with that? And as heartbreaking as that would be to any of us to hear our spouse say those words, multiply that by 1,000,000,000,000 or something, and maybe we're starting to get close of the heartache that we bring to God. When we say, "God, I love you. I'm all yours. I'm all in. I'm committed to you. Nevertheless, I want to fiddle around over here with this stuff." This thing that we see Jehoram doing is not some distant, old, dusty historical fact that has no relevance to us. I would suggest to you that what we see here directly relates to our life today, because you and I can be just like Jehoram. There's so many examples. Maybe your marriage is intact, but the truth is, behind the scenes, you know that you're not committed to your spouse. There are things that you're hiding from your spouse. There are thoughts or actions that you keep secret. Maybe your relationship looks good in public, but behind the scenes it's just barely hanging by a thread. That's Jehoram. Half committed. Maybe your church attendance is impeccable. I mean, you could go back to when you were 4 years old and show all the gold stars that you've won for Sunday school and church attendance. I mean, it's flawless. And in the eyes of other people, they look at you and go, wow, I wish I was like that. But the truth is, your own personal love and hunger for God died a long time ago. And you're just on autopilot. You're just showing up and going through the motions. That's Jehoram. We've got to be very careful not to say, well, I'm doing good in this one thing over here. Let's talk about that, hey? How good am I doing here? When all the while, we're allowing other areas of our life to go unchecked. So that's Jehoram. And then we've got Jehoshaphat. We talked about him already in the recent weeks, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'll just sum it up like this. Jehoshaphat shouldn't even be in this chapter. And it's a shame that his name appears with these other wicked men. He shouldn't even be here. We've already seen earlier how he made an alliance with wicked King Ahab. God called him out for that later at the end of 1 Kings. And now he's doing the very same thing with Ahab's son, Jehoram. The Bible tells us at the end of 1 Kings, Jehoshaphat was a man of God. He's a man who followed God and walked in his ways, except that he did not tear down all the places of idol worship, and he made an alliance with King Ahab. He's a man of God. He has no business partnering with these wicked kings, never mind going to war with them. And this decision that he's making here is going to put him in a real bad situation in just a moment. And then thirdly, we have Mesha, or Mesha, however you pronounce it. He is the king of Moab. The Moabites have a long, horrible, terrible history of evil, all the way back to Lot's daughters. When Ahab was alive, he was forcing King Mesha to pay him an exorbitant, we would say, tax. We just read the numbers there earlier of the lambs and the rams. And every year, he had to pay this to King Ahab, but the scriptures tell us now that old Ahab is dead, Mesha said, I'm not paying that anymore. I'm not paying it. It's almost like he was being held for ransom, and he just called their bluff. He said, I'm not going to do it. And so that's why Ahab's son Jehoram now is rounding up some others to go to war against Mesha, king of Moab. So we got Jehoram, we've got Jehoshaphat. They've combined their forces, and they're going to fight the king of Moab. And they decide to march their troops to Moab by way of a place called Edom, E-D-O-M. And the reason they did that was so that they could, when they got to Edom, they could pick up the king of Edom and let him join in with them. So now there would be 3 kings going to war against Moab. Verse 9. So the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom, and they marched on that roundabout route, or it could be interpreted that meandering route, that long meandering route. 7 days, and there was no water for the army, nor for the cattle that followed them. Now, there was a shorter route to get there, a much shorter route. But they chose to go this way. And it took them along a much longer, rougher route to get to Moab. And it took them so long that they ran out of water in this very dry and hot part of the world. And running out of water there puts you in a dire situation. These kings and all of their people and all of their animals, they weren't just thirsty now. They were facing death. So this isn't like, hey, can we pull off the next exit? I want to get a large sweet tea. You know, kind of got a hankering for something. This was way past that. They were facing possible death. And just like people do when things go wrong, Jehoram immediately blames God. Verse 10. And the king of Israel said, alas. Anybody use that word this week? See if you can work it into a sentence this coming week. Alas, the Lord has called these three kings to give them into the hand of Moab. Now, the truth is, God hadn't called these kings to do anything. They hadn't even sought the Lord on their plans. But of course, now that their plans have gotten them into trouble, suddenly it's God's fault. Well, at least Jehoshaphat remembers where to turn for help. Verse 11. But Jehoshaphat said, is there no prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord by him? So one of the servants of the king of Israel answered and said, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who poured water on the hands of Elijah. And Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. That's to see Elisha. Now, I'll point this out just quickly because we've talked a little bit about from way back in 1 Kings chapter 19, where Elijah called Elisha into the ministry of prophet to succeed him. And all those years that Elisha spent in the shadows, in the background, just serving Elijah. He didn't have a name, he wasn't a big shot. And here now, all these years later, isn't it interesting how this man said, Elisha, we can go see Elisha. Remember, he's the one who poured water on the hands of Elijah. You know what he's saying? He was the servant. He was the servant who had to wash his master's hands and feet and sweep the floor and do all that stuff. Elisha is still remembered by some people as just being the number two guy. And he's okay with that. So off they go to see the prophet Elisha, and they get a rather surprising, unexpected response. Verse 13. And Elisha said to the king of Israel, now remember, he's talking to the king. You understand? You mess with the king. Elisha said to the king of Israel, what have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother. But the king of Israel said to him, no, for the Lord has called these three kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. Again, it's another lie. God never called these kings to do this. Elisha is bluntly saying, hey, if your gods are so great, go talk to them. I'm sure they'll help you. And of course, in his heart, Jehoram knows that that's a wasted effort because their gods cannot hear or see or feel or help. Elisha's seen this before, how people want nothing to do with God until there's a problem, and then they want God's help. We wouldn't know anything about that in our society today, would we? Do you know the highest church attendance in recorded U.S. history was the Sunday after 9/11? Oh, people were busy with their own lives and plans prior to that. Go to church with you? I don't think so. Oh, when the buildings fell, those people got in their car the next Sunday and they found a church to go. You know why? Ecclesiastes 3:11, God has put eternity in the hearts of men. They all know. They all know where to go for help when everything is falling apart. But boy, it's hard to get people to admit that. They all know. But those crowds who went to church after 9/11, they weren't interested in submitting their lives to God. They just wanted him to fix the problem. And that's what Jehoram is doing here. Do we ever use God as a spare tire in our trunk? Lord, that committing to you stuff, that seems like kind of a drag. But I'll let you know if I need you. Verse 14. Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, if I did not have regard or respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you nor see you. In other words, I wouldn't look at you or even acknowledge you. I mean, these are strong, fearless words. Elisha is making it clear that the only reason he's going to seek God for help for these men, is because of the presence of a godly man named Jehoshaphat. And I think this, to me, is a fascinating point that the unsaved world is oblivious to. Listen, the very presence of godly people is often the one thing that is holding back God's judgment on those who've rejected him. My mind goes to Genesis chapter 18, the last part of chapter 18, where God says he's getting ready to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their unrivaled wickedness. And Abraham says, Lord, if there are just 50 people there who love you, would you spare the city? God said, I sure would, for the sake of 50. And Abraham sort of negotiates down because he knows he ain't going to find 50 people in those cities who love the Lord. It was a terrible place. He gets down to 10. He says, Lord, how about 10? If I can find 10, would you spare the city? God said, yes, I would, for 10 people who love me. You understand the significance of that? That's huge. Your presence in this world, how can I say this? It's shifting the balance of God's judgment from falling. I wonder about America. America hasn't always been a great nation. I understand that. We've got a long list of problems and failures. But my dad tells me of a time when there was at least an undercurrent, a foundation of respect for God, even among those who were unsaved. He tells me he used to go sometimes to the little old Andy Griffith barbershop with his dad on Saturday mornings, and all the men would sit around talking, not